Why don't we talk about that today? You had penned a title for this, When NFP Isn't Good Enough. First of all, let's just define this thing. What is NFP?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this topic because um, next week, so this is being recorded on a Thursday, so the week that this comes out for most people will be NFP Awareness Week, which is sponsored by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. So I felt like with the topics we've been covering and the pillars of our show, yeah, let's jump into talking about NFP and Humanae Vitae. So NFP stands for Natural Family Planning, which is the church's response to the moral teaching of Humanae Vitae, and before then, Humanae Vitae is the most definitive teaching in the modern church that reaffirmed the church's moral prohibition on artificial contraception. And natural family planning was the church's one of the church's pastoral responses to that, using tracking biological fertility signs to help a couple know when they are fertile and when they're not, when they're capable of getting pregnant or not, and using that to space children temporarily or indefinitely.
Mm-hmm. Well, good. So let's get into all of this. And, you've got a story that you have shared. And of course, as someone in your line of work, it does come up. So, hello, friends, and welcome to Pope Francis Generation. It's the show for Catholics struggling with the church's teaching, who feel they might not belong in the church anymore, and who still hunger for a God of love and goodness.
Your hosts are me, Paul Fahey, a professional catechist.
And I'm Dominic, someone who needs catechesis. Together, we're taking our own look at the Catholic Church, her teachings and practices from three views that changed our world.
And those are the Kerygma, the Doctrine of Theosis, and the teachings of Pope Francis.
So together, with you, we're the Pope Francis Generation. Let's dive right in. And where do you want to start with this, Paul?
Yeah, I think first to start, just a gentle disclaimer that we're going to be talking pretty frankly about natural family planning and contraception and marital intimacy. So just a general disclaimer to start. So the question of why this topic. Oh man, there's so many places to start. I know where I want to end, but where do I want to begin?
Well, tell you what, one thing that might be helpful, perhaps for someone like myself, where what's the context for this? Like you've thrown out a couple of words here, like Humanae Vitae. Like, what is that? The official church, suggestion getting behind this response, with the situation. What's the context? Why is this a thing? For those who aren't as familiar with what it is, why are we talking about it at all?
Yes. So, Humanae Vitae was an encyclical written by Saint Pope Paul VI in the 1960s, following the 1970s. What year? 68 comes to mind. I think it was 68. Following the Second Vatican Council. At the Second Vatican Council, the Church, the bishops, wanted to address the moral question of contraception because a few decades previous, in the early 1900s, Protestant denominations had started allowing married couples to use artificial contraception, and it was a big thing within the culture at that time. Mm-hmm. So it was a very relevant and pressing moral discussion. At the Second Vatican Council, the bishops decided to essentially table that and send it to committee. They established essentially an advisory committee made up of lay people, married couples, and theologians to really investigate this issue and to advise the Pope, and so that Pope Paul VI could issue a teaching. And they actually advised the Pope, because the opinions of this committee were leaked to the press before this encyclical came out. And it was made known that the majority of the committee favored the church changing its moral teaching on contraception and allowing it in certain circumstances. So that's what people thought the Pope was going to teach. And then Pope Paul VI didn't teach that. He in many ways reaffirmed the traditional teaching of the church, and in his encyclical Humanae Vitae, where he said that, and I'll quote him, any action which either before, at the moment of, or after sexual intercourse is specifically intended to prevent procreation, whether as an end or as a means, is intrinsically wrong. That's like the crux of his document, and caused a lot of turmoil within the church that is still present today, 50 years after the fact. So like I talked about, one of the pastoral responses to that was, okay, so the church also doesn't teach that married couples should just have as many kids as they possibly can. And it teaches that married couples actually, what they need to be responsible. The phrase the church uses is responsible parenting, where they have to take into consideration the common good of the family and the dignity of the spouses and members of the family in their discernment of whether or not to have another child. And also there was a recognition at the Second Vatican Council that prolonged lack of marital intimacy can harm a relationship, can harm a marriage. So trying to balance all of those things, this idea of natural family planning came about. I mean, it was present before, but it started being promoted more after Humanae Vitae. And that's where a couple would track, and there's lots of different methods and ways to track a woman's biological fertility signs, and then to determine which parts of a woman's cycle she's fertile and which parts of the month she's not, of the cycle she's not fertile, and then choose to have sex on one time or another, depending on whether or not you want to have a child. So yes, that's some of the history and context.
Yeah, that's an overview. I think I'm going to keep just letting you drive here, because I guess the one question that comes to my mind then is, well, first an observation, maybe then a question. One is what's beautiful about this format is that it's engaging with the rhythms of the human body in a space of reverence, without an intent to be controlling it, either chemically, medicinally, or through other practices. So it's not a forceful approach. So in that sense, it makes sense why, as we in this past century have continued to deepen and clarify and just become just amazingly meticulous with the genius of the human body and how it works. It just makes sense that there would come a point where we would come to understand its rhythms, and then how the couple enters into that, again, with that sense of respect and reverence for how the human body works, and not from a space of controlling it. And of course, that's a whole different discussion why people would want that. We sort of covered that in the pro-life episode that we talked about. But I guess, and that's kind of what today's show is about, is like when it's not enough. Like you had mentioned the one point, this is what seems to happen, is kind of the culture that I've just known growing up with NFP was, it's kind of a no holds barred then. And I think a lot of, and this is my opinion, a lot of women may be concerned about this, and a lot of guys seem to be ecstatic about this, because it means that there's no, it's like, where are the guardrails? Like, where does it go wrong? Where is it insufficient? Or how does it end up, the culture that seems to grow up around it can then also become problematic. And that's where I was interested to have this discussion
Yeah.
with you because it's a good thing, but then it's like you mentioned, the tweets, air quotes, that came out before the actual document landed, and people assumed and just went to town practicing whatever. It's, how do I say this? It's like the document says what it says, but then it's how that is read or read into. And I guess what I'm curious with this conversation is, what does the document not say, and where is the freedom of conscience, that pastoral response, which is, it's just your wheelhouse in this whole topic, and everything really is like, what are those key things? Respect for the individual. How does that meet up with what is said, and then again what is not said, because a lot of things are touted online and it's not actually preached. So
Yes.
not sure exactly what the question was in there, but I think you know where I'm going.
Yeah. In my perspective, in my experience, so I am deep within the NFP subculture within the church. My parents taught NFP. They taught other couples NFP when I was a child, and my wife and I took NFP classes when we were engaged, and we have used 3 different methods of NFP throughout our marriage. And we are expecting our 5th child soon. I'm very much in this bubble. And I say bubble because, and this is just my perception on it, in surveys that have been done, somewhere around 90% of Catholics in the US do not follow the teaching of Humanae Vitae and use some form of contraception. And this, in my mind, created this subculture, this NFP bubble that in some ways has a lot of good things. It promotes the church teaching. It actually pushes in some way groups of people and people with influence to actually develop better methods of NFP. And it can be a place of encouragement and support for people using NFP. But just as any subculture, any bubble, there's toxic elements too. I've definitely seen and been a part of an us versus them mentality of this, we are the faithful Catholics, and there's this them out there, those 90% of other Catholics, a disdain. So this self-importance or self-righteousness in this us versus them mentality. And there is a lot of controlling behavior, and almost out of fear of, there's almost this fear of individual consciences, and that people's consciences are just waiting to justify people to sin, that the role of the conscience is very diminished, and almost looked upon, no, not almost, actually is looked upon with suspicion quite a bit in this culture. So I've been in this environment my entire life. And so my wife and I got married when we were Christmas break of our senior year of college. We got married, and 3 months later, so this is before we graduated college, we found out that we were pregnant with our oldest. And so he was born 2 weeks before our first anniversary. We found out after he was born that my wife has severe postpartum anxiety and depression.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And after he was born, when he was an infant, she would have panic attacks because of her postpartum anxiety. And shortly after he was born, we were pregnant with our second, because something else that we found out was, well, a lot of people, especially if they're nursing their baby, a lot of women, their fertility doesn't come back for a year or two after they give birth. my wife's fertility comes back within a couple of months. So, so we had a second child, and the postpartum depression and anxiety came back. And we had a third child, and the postpartum came back. And at that point, we were now on we'd switched NFP methods because the first one that we were using hadn't worked.
Mm-hmm.
And we were like, okay, we actually need to not get pregnant for a while for my wife's health.
Mm-hmm.
And we pretty severely, stringently practice NFP. I think we were texting pictures of our chart to our instructor every other week. And it was extremely stressful. So like, there's a lot of subjectivity within NFP where you have to read like biological signs and then chart them and then discern on the chart. So there's a lot of subjectivity, and that's made more difficult when the person reading those biological signs also has anxiety and is terrified of getting pregnant again because of that anxiety. So this was a very difficult period, and we had to play things extremely conservatively, which meant a lot of abstinence and, like I said, a lot of anxiety. And then 9 months after our third was born, we found out that we were pregnant with our fourth. And this was a total surprise. Like, we took our chart to our instructor and we're like, how did this happen? And she looked at us and she said, I don't know. We eventually moved on to a third method of NFP. Having like when we found out our fourth was born, and having it being a surprise, and having it being us actively trying to not be pregnant for a while, that took several months for the Lord to change our hearts. There were a lot of dark thoughts and a lot of dark feelings in the middle of that. But our fourth was born. We named him Francis, and he's wonderful. But my wife's postpartum came back just as bad or worse than it had before. And we had now a third method of NFP, which was better. But still, we had to play it even more conservatively because we played it pretty darn conservatively the last time. And my wife's on like the brink. We need to not have another child for a while. So this meant all of that anxiety and all of the abstinence and not sleeping because we have an infant, and also having 4 kids when the oldest hadn't turned 5 yet. And in this point, I was like, and I couldn't put words to it, but I was like, there's something insufficient here.
Right.
There's something that isn't working here. And I had like a personal blog at the time, and I wrote this short post that was titled something like, what do you do when NFP isn't good enough? And I didn't have answers. I just raised the question. And I was actually really surprised by the pushback I got on that. That I would even presume that NFP had any problems at all in the first place. But I also received a lot of people who were like, yeah, what do we do when it's not good enough?
Right.
And because of my own experience, the Lord was softening my heart to actually be able to hear people in a way that wasn't judgmental and wasn't defensive. And I started listening to people, and I started hearing stories of couples who would go a year or more at a time after every child they had, a year or more of abstinence at a time, because that was the only way they could guarantee that they weren't going to get pregnant again immediately after having a child. And I would hear stories of couples who would have to abstain months at a time, or years at a time because they had medical conditions that if the wife got pregnant again, she like her dying was very much on the table, right?
Mhm.
And the ways that this not only like was extremely challenging and put a lot of strain, I mean that's an understatement, a lot of strain on their marriage and on their family,
Mhm.
but also the way that it impacted their relationship with God and their relationship with the church. I saw
Mhm.
people, I saw marriages fall apart. I saw
Mhm.
people leave the church. I saw people grow deeply, just deeply embittered. They stayed, but they're just
Yeah.
embittered. And this just reaffirmed like there is something that is insufficient here.
Mhm.
And it was around this time that I started reading a lot of Pope Francis. And after I read Amoris Latitia, I was like, there's something here
Mhm.
that's relevant.
Mhm.
And then I started studying the Kerygma and studying theosis and all the things that we've talked about, conscience and all of that. And I'm
Mhm.
like, there's something here. So a couple of years ago, I kind of put all of my experiences and all of my research into an article I wrote for Homiletic and Pastoral Review, which we'll probably link to in the show notes.
Mhm.
And it brought together a genuine pastoral response for couples in these extremely difficult positions when
Mhm.
NFP and the culture around NFP is insufficient for their
Right.
circumstances.
Yeah. The um, very in a similar way, my wife and I have been just navigating, trying to discern this. She's been sick for about 10 years and very, very slowly getting better. And it's just not been practical to have any more. She's just unable to handle that. And so these same questions and the frustration that I've had, and hence starting a show like this to start to understand what have I misunderstood in my formation that's making this harder than it needs to be, and feeling stuck between two immovable, rock in a hard place, rock of Peter, as it seems,
Yeah.
but then it's inaccurate to actually say that, because there's, like last episode we talked about spiritual abuse, kind of the brandishing of hellfire as a means of keeping you on the straight and narrow without respecting where people are on their journey. We can get into that in a little bit. So that's the one side, a sense of spiritual abuse and how things are interpreted and how people are demanded. And then on the other side, the healthy, flourishing functioning of the thriving human body and a loving couple that is meant to communicate a bond and willingness for each other in how they live their lives and in physical embraces and all in intimacy and all of that. And to have one pitted against the other, I could understand, not could, can, why so many, like you just said, become disillusioned, because it's like you can't get out, you can't
Yeah.
move, you
Yeah.
can't make a choice, and you're not free.
Yeah.
And once you're in that tension, it's like, I'm done, I'm out. I can understand that.
The audience I had in mind when I wrote this article, and it was very specific. It's a couple who actually believes and wants to follow the church's teaching because they believe it to be good and they believe it to be true,
Mm-hmm.
but whose marriage they fear is deteriorating because of a lack of intimacy,
Mm-hmm.
who have health risks or financial risks or other things going on that would make pregnancy an extreme hardship or life threatening, and who fear that that one mistake in the in the church's like one mistake in their sexual behavior is going to cut them off from God, and cut them off from the church, or threaten them with hell.
Very Baltimore Catechism.
Yeah, and you said felt trapped, and I think the word I used was cornered. Like it's the exact same thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
The sense of like I have no way out, which should be a sign that there's abuse of conscience going on.
Exactly.
Again, if not by an individual, but by a culture that would put someone in this position of feeling cornered like that.
Mm-hmm.
You want to walk through some catecheses?
Let's do this.
Okay. So my goal today on this episode is to walk through the main things of that article. So we're going to step way back and then kind of approach this topic again, right? So I want to start with the moral law. And in the Catechism, it says that God revealed the moral law in 2 stages. The first stage was the objective moral law as best expressed by the 10 Commandments. And we can't really downplay this in any way. It is extremely important and essential for us to have the objective moral law. It's extremely important for us to be able to judge other people's actions and our own actions according to what is going to bring us flourishing and happiness in life, or what is going to bring us in our community suffering and death. And we need the objective moral law. I think of like the modern world. How do we navigate weapons of mass destruction and nuclear weapons and bioethics and emerging technologies? How do we navigate that in any meaningful way without an objective moral law, right? You think of like the U.S. dropping the bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima and the circumstances of that, of the war that they were in and the future they were staring down. You need to have an objective moral law to be able to navigate those things in any meaningful way.
Right.
So we can't downplay that. But then the Catechism says the moral law, the objective moral law, the 10 Commandments are insufficient. That's the word the Catechism used. They're not good enough. They're not good enough precisely because, while they are a statement of what's true, they do not actually give someone the power to live it out. And I think all too often, teachers and apologists in the church present the moral law in a way that would presume that being convinced of the objective truth, that something is wrong, is enough for someone not to act that way. That simply knowing the commandments is enough for someone to follow the commandments, which isn't true. And because this isn't true, but it's being presented that way, it can lead believers to resent God, to resent the church, to resent the moral law, to feel cornered. And we do this especially with sexual morality. And I see this especially within this NFP subculture, where it's like, this is what the church says, so you should be able to follow it because this is the objective truth. Okay. So then the Catechism says the second stage of God's revelation of the moral law is Jesus Christ himself, especially seen in the Sermon on the Mount. And I think we've talked about this before. There's a scene a line or a scene in the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus says, quoting the 10 Commandments, "You've heard it said to you, anyone who kills their brother is liable to judgment. But I say to you, anyone who holds anger and resentment in their heart towards their brother is liable to the same thing." And then Jesus says, "You've heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. I say to you, anyone who lusts after a woman in their heart commits adultery," right? He is not watering down the moral law. He's actually saying, no, like, because what's more difficult, not killing someone or not having anger and resentment towards someone, right? He's not watering it down. And then he just says, just be perfect as God your Father is perfect. That's it. That's all we got to do. Now, if we were to hear this teaching from Jesus with the mindset of the first stage of Revelation, the mindset of the Old Testament, we would walk away discouraged because we would recognize I am not able to get the anger out of my heart towards people who've hurt me. I am not able to rid my heart of lust. I am not able to be perfect as God is perfect.
Mm-hmm.
But the commands of Jesus are not just commands. They're also promises.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus is saying that with me and in me and through me, I will free your heart from anger. I will free your heart from lust. I will make you perfect as God is perfect. And as we've talked about this, this whole season, our whole show, this is what salvation is God making us divine, God making us into another Christ, right? Jesus Christ himself is the fulfillment of the moral law. And we are able to follow the moral law by him making us like him, by him configuring us to him, by him making, and this is something Pope Francis has said, the Holy Spirit makes our mind like Christ's mind and our heart like Christ's heart, so that we can see others and love others the way he does. And it's not just that God gave us the objective moral law, and it's not just that he gave us the strength through grace, through Christ, to be able to live it out, but actually God he changes our desires so that we want to. The Catechism says that the life of virtue, right, a life that's conformed to Christ, makes living out the moral law is easy and joyful, is what the Catechism says. Right? The Church teaches that grace actually changes our desires so that we want what Jesus wants. Mm-hmm. This is an understanding of the moral law. Okay. It's important to note, though, if you have any questions, interrupt me. I can just keep going.
I will, but fire away.
Okay. It's important to know that this transformation does not happen all at once. And the Church is absolutely clear about this. It's not like you're baptized and then, bam, you can be a Mother Teresa in the world, right? That ordinarily the Church teaches this process happens within time. So this is a quote from Pope Francis from his apostolic exhortation, Gaudete et Exsultate. He says this: grace, precisely because it builds on nature, does not make us superhuman all at once. Grace acts in history. Ordinarily, it takes hold of us and transforms us progressively. If we reject this historical and progressive reality, we can actually refuse and block grace, even as we extol it with our words. It's not like St. Peter met Christ and then he was able to do everything Christ said. It's not even like St. Peter saw the risen Lord and walked with him for 40 days and then could follow what Jesus said. Even after Pentecost, when he received the fullness of the Holy Spirit, St. Peter was still messing up and Paul had to correct him, right?
I feel like a corollary here would be like watching someone play basketball on YouTube, right? Michael Jordan shooting that perfect shot.
50 times in a row.
You watch it on repeat. And then you head out to the basketball court and try it yourself. And it's going to take you won't get it on the first try. It will take you a long time because there's the building up of your body, of the mind, of the choices and the moments. These 10 commandments, these lines from, like you're pointing out from what Christ is saying, these are like the hyper distilled thoughts. These are like the stars that must orient us, but then we have to work through living them out. And I think that's where you're going with this, is the our capacity to understand them is one thing. Our capacity to honestly and faithfully, or honestly and brokenly implement them as we're also trying to navigate living a livable life with whatever else is going on. One, God takes all of that into account. And it's not practical to assume, here's a checklist of 10 things, go and live a great life. It's like, well, and that's what history is people wrestling.
There's a hidden presumption amongst many people, and the Pope calls this neo-Pelagianism. And that's this idea that every Christian is always capable of following the moral law. that is a reality that everyone can achieve, any Christian can achieve at any moment, because they've received the grace of baptism. And they quote the New Testament from St. Paul that says, God's grace is sufficient. Okay. God's grace is sufficient. But the church also recognizes that God does not immediately heal everybody all at once. He doesn't. God's grace is ultimately sufficient. But God chooses, it's his choice to transform us, to heal us and transform us in a process, progressively, within time and within history. This is the Lord's work. This is not our work. We must cooperate, but this is the Lord's work. But there's moments then in this time of, in this process, where we can understand the moral law and believe it to be true and good, but not yet be free enough, not yet be healed and transformed enough to actually follow it. So this is where we get into the church's teaching, and we've talked about this before as well, on mortal sin. Mm-hmm. The church says, and this is a quote from the Catechism, imputability and responsibility for an action can be diminished or even nullified by ignorance, inadvertence, duress, fear, habit, inordinate attachments, and other psychological or social factors. Meaning, someone can know what's good and true and believe it to be good and true and want to do it because they believe it to be good and true, but not be able to, not have the freedom to, because of any one of these things that the church lists. And that's because this is someone who has been transformed enough to understand the moral law and to live it out maybe in a great way, mm-hmm. but who has not yet been transformed to follow the moral law perfectly yet. Like, they're in this process.
I think a good metric for getting a sense of how we're allowing people to be where they are on their journey, and we talked about this in a previous conversation on conscience. I think a good metric might be to look at some of the saints, for example. And I think they're elevated as saints for us because they model a space of compassion and clarity, but primarily that compassion and understanding for where somebody is in their capacity to understand and then integrate and then model, for others or for themselves. But it's a good, I think, for me, it's become a good metric to get a sense of where somebody else is on their journey when they've understood something and then they all too easily lambaste everybody else for not, as you've pointed out, that neo-Pelagianism. If you've understood it, you should be able to do it.
Yeah.
And it doesn't take into account, as the Catechism itself has pointed out, the either ignorance, inadvertence, duress, fear, just habits, attachments. All of that is stuff we're working through constantly. And like you say, that can nullify in as far as that person's relationship with God. We may not agree with it, but it's not up to us. And they aren't, somebody else wrestling with these kind of questions don't answer to us. And we may not like it, but it's not about us. And that's a good metric, I think, for how defensive are we getting about somebody else's choices. Like, wait a second, it's not you. Do and be the best you can, obviously. Beam in your own eye, and recognize they are in a different place, maybe in a different capacity to understand, because saying the same word does not mean the same thing to two people sitting in the same audience. You get one speaker and they say something, and you have 1,000 people, it will be taken 1,000 different ways.
Yeah. And we constantly, I see this in the church all the time. I have seen, priests have challenged me on this. Catechists have challenged me on this. People, I see this all of the time, where the church has 3 criteria for mortal sin. The object is grave and severely wrong. You have to have sufficient knowledge, and you have to have sufficient freedom.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's 3 criteria for mortal sin, and what I see all the time is conflating or collapsing.
Right.
Where we say, if someone did something that was gravely wrong, therefore they've committed a mortal sin, with no regard for if they knew it was wrong or if they were free when they did it. Or we collapse knowing and we collapse freedom into knowing. And we say, well, if they knew that it was wrong and they did it anyway, then they must be guilty of it. And if that were true, then someone like, and we've talked before about Saint Mark, where he was denied absolution and denied communion because he was addicted to opium, because the priest didn't think that he wanted to be free of this addiction enough. Now, we recognize that he wasn't actually free and that he wasn't actually guilty of a mortal sin, because if he were, grace would not have transformed him to such a point where he was able to die as a martyr. So what I believe there's so much confusion around this teaching, and I hear this conflation all of the time. And I especially hear it when it comes to the church's sexual teachings, right? I think there's so much of a culture of defensiveness that we have to defend the objective evil of sexual immorality, that we present every violation of the church's sexual teaching as a mortal sin, as an act that damns someone to hell, as an act that bars someone from communion unless they go to confession, as an act that separates someone from God. This can easily lead couples who are striving to follow the church's teaching to disproportionately judge their relationship with God on their ability to keep the church's sexual rules. And they live in fear of falling into hell, falling into mortal sin, just by making a mistake, by doing something that they didn't freely choose. So like this culture around Humanae Vitae and around NFP has created this controlling of other people just by misrepresenting the church's teaching on mortal sin. You want to get to your favorite section, which is, so what do we do with this?
Well, there you go. Why not? Let's do that. So let's move into the pastoral applications or responses to it. Before doing that, we want to take a moment just to thank our sponsor that is helping us to bring this show to you. There are Select to Give. And as they say, more Catholic leaders choose Select International Tours than any other pilgrimage company. With 35 years of award-winning travel planning, they have a track record of excellence and faithfulness. And they're a small company with a big heart, because every one of their pilgrimage trips helps to support and fund their 501c3 charity work, helping Christian families thrive in the Holy Land. So if you're ready to travel, or if you're looking to lead a group of your own, take the next step on your pilgrimage by visiting selectinternationaltours.com. Alrighty, Paul, let's now talk about, now that we've gone through the theory, we've gone through the context, let's talk about the pastoral steps, and let's talk about what this document or this discussion does not say, so that we can make a free response with our own consciences.
Yeah. So I have in mind with this pastoral application, the audience that I've already talked about, right? Couples who strive to follow the church's teaching, who desire to follow the church's teaching, but who find themselves cornered or stuck because of their circumstances. Or people who are pastoring or in some way a friend to or accompanying people in this situation. The first step is to pray, ask the Holy Spirit to help us know God's love and goodness more, to know the kerygma more, to know his desire for us, even in the midst of our weakness. Because this is the thing. I think we have, I'll get to that. But to know God's love and goodness more. And the second thing is to have this vulnerable prayer that we've talked about in several episodes, going before the Lord, honest with him about our desires and about our fears and about our frustrations and about how we feel stuck, honest with ourselves about those things, and just bringing those things to the Lord and offering them to him and waiting for him to speak into them. Next is to lean into the sacraments. Lean into your baptismal identity as a new Christ. Lean into the sacraments, the healing sacraments of confession and the Eucharist, and our own marriage as well, right? That within marriage, every act of love towards our spouse, towards our kids, is God making us more like him, right? Okay. I think what's difficult in this is that because of that Catholic culture, that many couples who are striving to follow this teaching have been formed by, there's this belief that every fault, every fall, every weakness in someone's sexual life cuts them off from God and the church and cuts them off from the sacraments, which can easily lead to a legalistic view of the sacrament of confession, which as seen as like a legal thing, where like I have broke the rule and now I need to have that be forgiven, that ledger wiped clean in a legalistic way. However, and this is really important, our weakness, I'm not saying our free sin, which is different, our freely chosen sin, grave sin, mortal sin, cuts us off from God and the church. But our weakness does not. Actually, our weakness is precisely why the church exists, is to heal us from our weakness and transform us and make us like Christ. So this is where we hear Pope Francis teaching that the Eucharist is not a prize for the perfect, but medicine for those who are weak, he says, right? And Pope Francis also says that confession is not a dry cleaner, something that wipes our ledger clean in a legalistic way, but rather an encounter with Jesus who waits for us just as we are. I think of the story of the woman at the well, where Jesus sat there waiting for her, just as she is, not expecting her to be anything different than who she was, just to encounter her. Our weaknesses do not cut us off from God. They are instead the very thing that keep us running back to God to receive his healing and his grace and his power and his love. So in our weakness, we should not feel cut off from the church and from the sacraments. In our weakness, we should be running back towards them with open arms. Okay, so prayer, sacraments. And then the last one is to form and trust and follow one's conscience. And for more about this, go and listen to our episode about conscience. But briefly, it means like knowing that we must form our conscience. We form our conscience through that vulnerable prayer, through knowledge of Scripture, knowledge of the church's teaching, counsel from others. But also knowing, and this comes from Amoris Latitia. So this is a quote from the Pope. He says this: conscience can do more than recognize that a given situation does not correspond objectively to the overall demands of the gospel. In other words, he's saying our conscience can recognize whether or not our behavior violates the commandments. But it can do more than that, the Pope says. He goes on, it can also recognize with sincerity and honesty what, for now, is the most generous response which can be given to God, and come to see with a certain moral security that this is what God himself is asking amid the concrete complexity of one's limits, well not yet fully the objective ideal. What the Pope is saying here is that through our conscience, God can show us our circumstances and our weaknesses. And in light of those things, the next step he wants us to take, that we are able to take, even with the limitations of our weaknesses, and even if that step does not fully meet the demands of the moral law. He is pleased. It is his will for us to take that step. It's not his will that we're not fully living the objective moral law. It's his will that we're choosing to progressively follow him in the way that he's asking us to. And it's too important to remember here that an objective violation of the moral law isn't always a mortal sin. It doesn't always cut us off from God, precisely because of weaknesses, right? Our ignorance, inadvertence, duress, habit, fear, and other psychological and social factors. but it's our conscience that can tell us our weaknesses in the midst of those circumstances.
Yeah.
And then
this reminds me of I don't know where this originated. It's probably every culture has stories like this, but of a story about contemplative prayer, and a young monk runs to the Father Abbot and says, I tried to, pray my rosary, whatever, sit in meditative prayer, and my mind just kept wandering like 1,000 times. I failed 1,000 times. And the Father Abbot says something like, next time, think of it as 1,000 fresh opportunities to turn your attention back to what you're trying to focus on, back to God. And that should be the way that we think about or approach moments of weakness, moments of failure, and so on. Is not as, dang nabbit all, I failed again. I am such a sinner. Even Christ doesn't speak to us like that. Instead, every opportunity is, well, that happened. Let's work on not doing that again. Let's get back to, just try again. And for in this sort of space, there's often a lot of scrupulosity, and I fear that, unfortunately, those who are scrupulous then tend to also can speak loudly, or we've had teachings passed down by people who observed this with an unfortunate scrupulosity, and that creates again that sense of fear around how to observe these things, and for those who do struggle with this, which was completely me for years, and my wife also for ages, and so we both ended up, one of the things that kind of helped us get out of that was recognizing that in each other, and then talking about that, and learning to be kind and to be patient with ourselves, and recognizing that the presence of a weakness, or the fear of a weakness, is not itself, and like you just pointed out with conscience, if you're not absolutely sure that what you did was definitively a wrong thing, then it probably wasn't. Because if it was, you would know, and your scrupulosity wouldn't just be like spider tingling.
Yeah, I think it's scrupulosity, and I think it's consciences that have been damaged or malformed by
traumatic situations and bad teaching. Yeah.
Yep. Now, to be clear here,
mm-hmm.
The use of contraception is objectively wrong, and the church teaches that because it's harmful. It's not something the church just makes up. Everything the church says is wrong. It says it's wrong because it's harmful to people. And that this does not diminish the objective evilness, whatever that means,
mm-hmm.
of contraception. But our weaknesses do diminish our subjective freedom, and therefore our subjective culpability, right?
Mm-hmm.
And even then, the church recognizes there's a document from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which teaches on behalf of the Pope, that came out after Humanae Vitae, that said, the Catechism's teaching on fear and ignorance and all these factors reducing culpability, this also applies to contraception. It applies to everything. Like, the church reaffirmed that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not this teaching does not diminish the objective moral teaching.
Mm-hmm.
It's not what the John Paul II and Pope Francis have called a gradualness of law, mm-hmm. which would say that the law is, this is less immoral for some people because of their weakness, and more immoral for others who don't have that weakness. That's not what the church is saying. But rather, it's a law of gradualism. So it's not a gradualism of law, but a law of gradualism,
mm-hmm.
which recognizes that someone's freedom to follow the moral law
mm-hmm.
increases within time and is progressive and happens
mm-hmm.
gradually. And the Lord meets us precisely where we're at and moves us forward.
Yep.
And that's something that...
I was just going to say, if the inverse was true, then clerics and academics would be paragons of virtue. And I'm sure some of them think they are, and they're all very, very human.
Yeah.
like the rest of us. So just on the face of it, it's not true. Just simply knowing this stuff
Yep.
does not, well, it does not save you. Isn't that the line? The law will not save you.
Yeah. So not at all to compare contraception to the use of atomic weapons. I'm not doing that. But you look at the circumstances at the end of World War II and the people who made the decision to drop the atomic bombs. Dropping an atomic bomb on a population, on a civilian population, is gravely, gravely evil. Maybe I don't know if there's anything more evil than that, right? Now the circumstances that the U.S. was in was horrible. They're still going through a world war, and they're looking at Japanese military and regime and population that are willing to fight to the last person, and millions of people could die if this war drags out for any length of time. Okay. So they do an ends justify the means calculus and be like, we can end this war now by killing all these people in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, but it's going to force the Japanese hand. We're going to end the war, and we're going to save millions of future lives, right? The church rejects that type of ends justify the means calculus.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to say that decision was wrong. It was objectively wrong to drop those bombs. And look at the harm that it did. But at the same time, there's a recognition, at least I would recognize, I would not want to be the leaders who made that choice. And I could say that I'm not going to assume that they did so with full freedom. I imagine they did so because they believed their hands were tied and they had no other
Felt like
option.
the only possible option, or it was presented that way, or
yeah. So, like going back to then NFP and contraception, the key thing here with this following of conscience, and this recognition of weakness and culpability, is that this discernment is dynamic. It must continue to be happening. This formation of conscience must always be happening. We must always be open, the Pope Francis says, to new stages of growth and new decisions which can enable the ideal, the commandments, to be more fully realized all the time. Because the ideal, the commandments, are not something that are inachievable.
Mm-hmm.
They may be inachievable at a particular moment for a particular person, but they're not just ideals that exist in the abstract, right? Okay. This is not an excuse to sin. Not at all. I mean, the presumption is that these are couples who know and believe that the church's teaching is good and true in the first place, right? This isn't an excuse to sin. And it must be a movement that's always dynamic, like I said, but always progressing towards a fuller, like more freedom and a fuller embracing of the moral law. If it becomes stagnant or comfortable, then we're talking about a different thing, right? I feel like there's more that I was going to say, but that's what I have for now. Thoughts, questions?
Let's just recap kind of what's been covered, because we've covered a bunch, and I get the sense that one of the intents for this conversation was to clarify how a lot of us approach this topic, and as much as we wrestle with it, to then impute our conclusions on others in ways that the church herself does not. Now, it's probably beyond the scope of this discussion to then actually, to try to answer or resolve, or, that's not maybe our place. But I think it is incredibly important, is to be aware, and that's what I think you've been bringing to us here, is to be aware and to take care of the toxicity that can surround the repression of conscience, the fear of allowing people to be wrestling and working through their own consciences, and it's not up to us to assume they're not doing a good job of their own lives or whatever. It's just, that's just not up to us. And so back over to you, if you were to recap what we've covered.
Yeah, it's we don't need to be defensive. Respecting people's consciences isn't isn't a wishy-washy Catholicism, and it's not a, well, you're just giving people an excuse to sin. It's actually respecting people's freedom the way that God respects our freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not, because the opposite of that is to impose and control, which ultimately, as the Pope says, makes for misery for everybody, for the whole community. So there has to be this recognition of the Church's teaching is objective teaching, and we believe it to be good and true because we're Catholics. And our heart, and our mind may be more or less convinced of that, but we're Catholics and we believe the Church's teaching is good and true. Okay. But that the objective teaching of Humanae Vitae may be true, that fact does not mean that everybody who's Catholic is now able to follow that teaching. Mm-hmm. That may be something that in some circumstances needs to be worked out in time, with vulnerability and honesty and sincerity and humility before the Lord. And this defensiveness that we may have about other people's behavior, or this fear of that conscience somehow gives other people license, I think it's something that if we see that within ourselves, we need to bring that to the Lord and ask why those things are present. Why are we trying to possess this, possess other people's behavior in this way? Mm-hmm. Why aren't we able to love them freely? And I think it's just giving couples in difficult situations like this a lot of space and a lot of grace and a lot of sensitivity, and not judgmentalism, and not throwing apologetics at them as if knowing the teaching better is going to make this any easier. Mm-hmm. But helping them trust in the Lord's goodness and mercy, and then trust in their conscience more.
So it's an invitation to, well, among our listeners anyway, to both sides. If you're on the one side and maybe you know more and this stuff just feels more obvious and so on to you, then, like you said, to offer that space of kindness, of understanding, of compassion, of walking with them. I think it's so easy to downplay that. I think that if the immediate reaction is to downplay that, well, you're probably not going to enjoy this show too much. But it is an art form that every human has to learn. And then on the other side, for those who this is not obvious to, it's just be patient with yourself. The next step might be to learn. The next step might be to educate, form your conscience, but also be aware and wary of the toxicity. It is there. And those with the biggest, it's like those with the, how does that phrase go? I can't remember, but it's like, I'm always afraid of people who rivet on a single idea and then beat that drum to hell.
Yeah.
Because that shows an incapacity to understand how a human life expresses and dilutes and embodies a journey. And that's why I think we end up calling that radicalism, fundamentalism, or online, we might just call that toxic human behavior, an inability to practice that empathy of seeing another human person. And that's so. I think that's a great place to wrap, and I would imagine people are still going to have questions because it is a big discussion and we didn't really provide a lot of answers. But what we did was, I hope, try to clear the air around some of the toxicity and allowing people that, we are friends with, people we know of, or people who just they can't see it, or they can't get it, or they don't want to yet. All of those are totally different spaces, different places in that journey. For those who do have questions and maybe do want to reach out to you privately because it is a sensitive topic, Paul, how can they do that? Where can they find you online?
Yeah, you can find me at popefrancisgeneration.com, and you can reach out to me there. I'm going to be sharing this podcast there, but I'm also going to be sharing the article that I've referenced in the show notes here, and I'll be talking about it next week, which will be this week by the time you're listening to this, there as well. So you can find me there. You can support the show there, and the writing, and this podcast, and the other work that I do, and hopefully have more discussion on that platform as well.
Absolutely. And as if you've, dear listener, dear watcher, have been following us for a little while, you'll see how grounded Paul is in the vision of Pope Francis, our Holy Father. As you know, maybe there are other catechists out there. If you know them, we would love to meet them. Please introduce them to us. But for those who are trying to create the kind of leadership, the kind of content, talking through, walking through, working with, these distillations that he shares, and then tracking them, in ways that we can understand, perhaps in the First World West. If you live in other places around the world, you need your own catechists because of your own cultures and words and ways of. We're trying to minister in a way to the First World West. So, for those who think like this, who are enjoying this show, please do hit that like button. It really helps people to discover what Paul is sharing and what we're doing with Pope Francis Generation, the show, and also with Smart Catholics, which is the sort of the partner in creating this and bringing this together. We are an online community. If you do enjoy these kinds of discussions, we are building this community online because, weirdly enough, we can't find anything else like it. And it's just sad to kind of make a name for being Catholics who love the Holy Father. We're Catholics. That's supposed to be a default, but sadly today it's not. So if this sounds like you, come and check us out at smartcatholics.com. So again, if you got a question for Paul, visit popefrancisgeneration.com. Paid subscribers get to watch these episodes before anybody else, join private Q&As, and you can pitch ideas for the topic of our final show this season, which I think is, as of this recording, next week, right, Paul? We'll be going live?
Yeah, so in 2 weeks is our last show. And
right.
Next week we're going live. So if you are a paid subscriber, you'll get an invite to a live virtual recording, and then be able to be a part of Q&A at the end of that discussion.
Yeah, that's going to be special. So, dear friends, till next time, say a short prayer for us and for yourself. Remember, don't be afraid to ask questions. Doubts can be a sign that we want to know God better and more deeply. God bless you.